Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the zoo. The minion with me this evening, thus far, is Adam.
Hello.
And I am the keeper for this night, as it is once again a Friday. Sanguine. How are you doing tonight, Adam?
Um, I'm doing all right. I I apologize for the tardiness. I worked on my laptop here, so I'm
Ah,
redoing everything over again, and still kind of ironing the kinks out. Um,
still a bit
namely the
warped.
furry stuff. But oof, that was bad. That was a bad joke to start it off with. Um,
So you're going for foxes, wolves, bunnies, or dogs? Those are the most common. Or cats. Those are also fairly common.
Uh, I don't know. I'm just making sure that shit is working. Um, Let me know if you hear any audio bits because last time I was streaming, I was getting some weird like gusty uh issues. So just let me know if that happens. I don't know.
Copy that. The only time that I'm hearing any sort of gusty is when you exhale. It sounds fairly close to the mic, but that's about it.
Oh, okay. Let me see.
Because it was somewhat of a when you were exhaling. Not sure if the mic picked that up. Hopefully it did.
No, I picked it up.
Okay. But yeah.
So, hey, what'd you cook for dinner?
Oh, I actually did not cook tonight because my mum is in town visiting. So we hit a local beer hall. And I had a fantastic dinner there. Also drank some amazing beers and had a rather good time. So I had a couple Scottish ales. I had a um, sour stout as well as a barrel aged porter, which was rather nice. Or sorry, it was a port barrel aged stout, not a porter. Porter and stout are similar. All porters are stouts, but not all stouts are porters.
How can you
So,
tell? How can you tell the difference?
well, it's the way that they are treated. So, like I said, all porters are stouts, but not all stouts are porters because in order for it to be a stout, it's rather malty. It's a dark, fairly black beer, whereas a porter is a stout that then has some additional limitations on it. So stouts are just really dark beers, and porters are stout. Porters is another way of calling them, often just shortened to porters. Uh, Guinness is actually a porter rather than just a stout, though it's often just designated as an Irish stout. And the reason why they're called porters is because they became very, very popular with porters at the dockyard. So
Oh,
they're
that makes sense.
yep, because they became very popular with porters, they just became known as porters. But the difference between them is that porters use 100% roasted malt, whereas stouts can use roasted and or roasted barley, roasted malt and unroasted barley. So they can use a blend, whereas porters have to be 100% roasted malt. But because you can have any percentage of roasted versus unroasted and malted versus unmalted in a stout, it just has to be that deep blackish color. all porters are stouts, but not all stouts are porters. Make sense?
As much as it's going to, I guess.
It's kind of like
Which one?
any shape that has 4 sides and all 4 sides meet at 90-degree angles are rectangles. But in order to be a square, it has to be 4 equal length sides that meet at 90 degrees. So it's a restriction of category. Causes it to become a square rather than just a rectangle. So too is it the case when it comes to stouts versus porters. Stouts just need to be a fairly black beer, and they can use malted or unmalted, and they can use roasted and unroasted grain. They just have to be very dark in color, whereas a porter has to be 100% roasted, 100% malted, and it has to have that dark color. So you end up with that crossover of the 2 categories. So all stouts are, all porters are stouts, but not all stouts are porters. It is absolutely delicious, though. And I love my porters because that rich malty note, which malted grains give a bit of sweetness to the beer. Because what malting of the grain does is it breaks down complex starches into simple sugars. So it has a sweeter taste from that. And it's an important facet of whiskey making as well. So it's kind of like how with Scottish whiskies, you use 100% malted grain. With Irish whiskies, you use a percentage of malted and a percentage of unmalted. And then with Scotches, you have normally double distilled, and they're peat smoked dried. Whereas with Irish, they are non-smoked, just dry, hot room dried grains. And then, like I said, they have malted and unmalted grain in the mix, and they are triple distilled rather than double distilled.
I'm not gonna lie, this is like an audible wine tasting. Like you're telling me these things, and it's like I would love to try these different types of flavors that you're describing. But I'm not. It's like, oh man, have you ever visited Tuscany? Oh no. Well, let me tell you.
Yeah, it ends up being something that if you try it without tasting it, then you can get some of an idea, but it doesn't fully grok what the difference is. Like why you can get that it has a different flavor, but you don't get why it has a different flavor. But then when it's explained and you taste it, it becomes oh shit, yeah, that would make a huge difference.
Yeah. It clicks together. It's okay, this is why it tastes like this, is because whatever process or change in its process.
Yeah, it finally clicks and it makes sense why it tastes that way rather than just it tastes different. Because if you have a Irish whiskey versus a Scottish whiskey versus a Welsh whiskey versus an American whiskey versus a Japanese
hold
whiskey,
on.
You can tell the difference immediately.
I don't understand why you went American whiskey when we could say you can tell the difference between, northern and southern whiskey. But yeah, no.
Because you have all these different types of whiskey, and you can tell the difference between the different types.
Yeah.
And you can tell the lineage of the different types, because Japanese whiskeys, which descend from the Scottish whiskey most strongly. You can taste the Scottish influence in the Japanese whiskey because it's a bit smokier than an Irish whiskey. But then you can taste the difference as well because Japanese whiskeys use a more Japanese flavor profile, especially when it comes to the barrel that they age in, because you'll end up with Japanese whiskeys aged in Mizunara oak. And you can taste the difference between Mizunara oak and American white oak or various other sorts of oak. And it is delicious. So I recommend trying a bunch of different types of whiskey and a bunch of different types of beer because good fucking God, if you find the one that you love, it is amazing.
Yeah, you gotta get your go-to.
Yep.
Shit, yeah.
Did you have more to say? Because you started with like you're about to say something.
Oh, I apologize. Shit, that's the second one. The third one, you can, full line to boot me out. But I will say this. Um, um, no, in terms of the whiskey, yeah, I should have gotten a whiskey, but I went with some tequila this evening. So I'm not
aged or virgin. So
kissing the floor type.
gold or
Bottom
white?
shelf white.
Gold or silver, rather.
Silver. Yeah, but no, that's not the thing. The thing is, I took a stop to the old granary shop, and I picked up some more mac and cheese, and I love this. I love this stuff. Stuff is delicious.
What makes that particular mac and cheese?
I don't know. I really don't know. All I know is that when they have it in stock, I'm like, yeah, I think I'll purchase some of this.
Fair enough.
It smells good, tastes good, and by golly, it makes me the man I am today, right now.
Nice. And
Yeah.
6 box tastes fantastic. At least a good box tastes fantastic. Double box, triple box, quads, all delicious.
But I want to ask, did you have anything in mind, or in terms of like any topics that you wanted to talk about?
Fairly standard Friday, where it is the feel of just a bunch of friends going belly up to the bar and talking whatever shit they decide to talk that night.
Are you sure you want that route?
Yes. It's the route that I have the most fun with because I can talk about fucking anything. You want to talk about mythology? Fan-fucking-tastic. I can talk about mythology. In fact, I was talking about mythology last night and how a lot of people misunderstand both Grecian and Egyptian mythology because
Wait, what do you
people.
mean?
Well, one of the things that happens in both Grecian and Egyptian mythology is different areas have different primary gods that they pray to, or that they prayed to, rather, since it's past tense for the most part. So you have to be somewhat dubious of the myths that passed on, since in Grecian mythology, it's really easy to explain this. You have the Athenians, who are known for their literature, they're known for their philosophy, they're known for their writing and their thinkers, right?
Among other things, sure.
And the Athenians, their primary deity that they would worship was Athena, because that was their primary deity of their cities.
Well, hold on. Are you talking? Wait, when you say mythology, are you
Yep.
talking their religion?
Yes.
Okay, because you said mythology, and uh, just a slight interrupt, but um, I was watching a thing on the start of Uruk in
Hmm.
Mesopotamia, and they had this somewhat similar structure of um,
Different
city states
cities had
being based on their
predominant
deity.
gods that they had,
Yeah.
because if your city state was a big worshiper of, let's see, what's Ishtar, then Ishtar would be the central focus of most of your myths.
Mhm.
And if
and and it I think by the time it got to like what was it called? There was not Bronze Age Greece, but the other Greece. Uh, I want to say before Alexander, but where they had more like
the Hellenic Greece
Hellenic.
versus
Yeah.
the Macedonian Greece.
Yes. It was more of a tempered down type of deity. It wasn't so much like the city states had their own deity, but they weren't fighting each other. Like
Well,
it.
they were to a certain extent, because you have, for example, what I was about to go into when you're talking about Athens. A lot of the myths and legends that we talk about to this day from ancient Grecian beliefs are from the Athenian tradition. So when you look at that, and a good chunk of the myths are damn near going down on Athena. Well, Athena was the primary goddess of the Athenians. So when it is waxing poetic about how wise, how grand, how amazing Athena was, and how Athena was able to become Pallas Athena. Do you know the origin of Athena versus Pallas Athena?
Nope.
So there's actually two different origin myths of Pallas Athena. So Pallas is a name that was used by both a Titan as well as a giant. And there's a version of Pallas Athena that originates from both the Titan Palace as well as the giant Palace. So one of them originated during the Titanomachy, which is one of the great overturns of the Grecian divine order. That was the war between the Titans and the Olympians.
Was that the
And
one
then,
where they used those like guys with a whole bunch of arms and shit?
oh yeah, that was the one where the Olympians called in the Hecatoncheires.
Yeah.
And
Hecatompyles.
the Hecatoncheires scared the ever living shit out of fucking everyone. It was glorious. So you have the Titanomachy, which was the Olympians versus the Titans. Then you have the Gigantomachy, which was the second major overturn of the Grecian order, which was the Giants versus the Olympians. And the Olympians nearly lost that battle, or lost that war, rather. And then you have the uh, revolution in, or the rebellion in Olympus, which is the third major overturn. And then you also have uh, Typhon. And Typhon is sometimes considered the fourth major overturn. Sometimes it's considered the third major overturn. Sometimes it's just considered one of the major crises without being considered an overturn. So, Pallas, in both the giant version of Pallas and the Titan version of Pallas, Pallas was this unbelievable powerhouse that had ridiculously durable skin to the point where they were almost immune to any weapon. Much in the same as the Nemean lion that Hercules then later strangles. And in both versions, Pallas was just wreaking fucking havoc upon the Olympians. until Pallas decided to stand up against Athena. And Athena lured Pallas into the fight, drew Pallas deeper and deeper behind enemy lines for Pallas, allied lines for Athena, and made it so that it was harder and harder for Pallas to actually fight, until eventually she was able to slay Pallas. In both cases, she threw a mountain on top of Pallas, crushing him. Whether it was Titan Pallas or Gigantomachy Pallas. At which point, she then skinned Pallas after killing him, and then donned his skin as armor. So when Athena was entering her more martial form, she would become Pallas Athena, because she was Athena donned in the hide of Pallas. Whereas when she was in her more civilized form, she was just Athena. So Pallas Athena became warlike Athena, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, like, you know, Hercules was very, I don't want to say strong, but like, what's it? Uh, dense, not dense. Um, the combination. Um, but when he had the the Nemenian lion's hide, uh, it just kind of added to his strength. It was like a extra bit.
Yeah, because when he was wearing the hide of the Nemean lion, he had this ridiculous armor. And yes, there is also the nymph version of Pallas, but the main one that ends up being talked about is Pallas the Titan or Pallas the Giant. Then there is also Pallas the Nymph. The Greeks started reusing names at a certain point in their history.
Yeah,
And
durability. Thank you, dude. Fucking tie.
in Pallas the Nymph, it was that she took the name as a homage to Pallas, which was a daughter of Triton, if I remember correctly. But yeah, there's the Titan Palace, the Giant Palace, and then the Nymph Palace. All of them are Pallas. All of them have a origin to why Athena was known as Pallas Athena. But I prefer the Giant and the Titan Palace because, like I said, she's more often called Pallas Athena when it comes to her martial aspect. So it makes sense that we have all these myths about Athena and how fucking badass Athena was and how she was always the hero of myths, because a lot of our myths come from Athens. And who the fuck did Athens pray to? I wonder. Athena. They're named after Athena. They worshipped Athena as their primary goddess. Whereas when you look at another Grecian deity, and you look at Ares, who was the primary Spartan deity, and Athens was constantly getting into a row with Sparta, Ares is treated like the red-headed stepchild in Grecian mythology. He's treated like an absolute bitch. He's defeated by Hercules. He's defeated by Athena during the Trojan War twice. He's beaten to within an inch of his life by the Titans. He's beaten within an inch of his life by the Giants. He's beaten within an inch of his life by the twinned sons of Poseidon. And there's a reason why he's done dirty in Greek mythology, because again, most of our mythology comes from Athens. When he's the major god of the antagonist state to the Athenian state, well, you're going to end up with a lot of, let's make him look really bad, which is what happened in mythology. So there's probably Spartan versions of the myths that have him being far more impressive, but Sparta was not really known for its scholarly tradition, shall we say. So we end up with the Athenian versions of Ares myths, where Ares is an absolute bitch. And Athena is top trumps. And then we end up with a fair bit of the other deities as well, because you have Apollo, which was, of course, Delphi, was the major area of worship for Apollo. And Athens did rather well when dealing with Delphi, so they did a lot of complementary work towards Apollo. You have a lot of complementary work towards Artemis and various other deities. And then you look at Egyptian mythology, and you have a very similar thing of the gods that are the most well-known, well, they're from the capital. So you have a lot of really complementary myths to Ra, Osiris, Horus. And you have substantially fewer when it comes to Set. Because Ra, Osiris, Horus were the major gods of the capital. Set, he had cities that were predominantly worshipping him, but they didn't really proliferate in the capital, so we don't have the same story. And there is actually a connection that you can take to modern times, Green Badger Outdoors, because this is a trend that you see throughout history, where the areas that end up with the greatest ability to manipulate how people see them throughout history are the areas that control the record. So if you have areas that are well known for writing, you have areas that are well known for their media output, they have a greater ability of controlling the overall perception, especially later on, than the areas that don't. And you see this in current day, when there's a reason why a lot of the insanity of the far left, shall we say, is proliferated. Well, look at where they have their strongholds. They have their strongholds everywhere that media proliferates. When all of the news channels, for the most part, are based out of New York, and the far left controls New York. It isn't so much that history is written by the victor as it is when we look back, the history that we find is the history that we assume. So part of that is history is written by the victor. But Greece didn't win against Rome. But a lot of Grecian scholars ended up spreading after the Roman Empire started. So we have a very glowing view of what Greece was like, despite them losing the war. This is one thing that the Irish did fairly well. The Irish have a rather glowing representation of themselves in most people's minds, because the Irish had this bardic tradition. So they had their histories, they had their songs, they had their culture proliferated through these venues, which means that it became rather strong and rather easy to sympathize with them. Whereas cultures that don't have that heritage, really, they end up being villainized. No one can argue that the Mongols weren't extremely effective and didn't win time after time after time after time. Yet, when we look back at the history of areas under Mongol reign, they aren't exactly talked about in glowing terms. No one looks at the Mongol conquest and says, oh yes, that was a time when we got conquered by the more civilized people. They look at Mongol conquest as utterly barbaric. And it's because Mongols didn't really have the scholarly backbone. So yeah, write it down. Write what your history is. Talk about your history. Make it a better story. And you're going to win. Or if you control the areas that deal with the preservation of history, then you're going to be the ones that end up writing the history. It's much like how the Soviets, yeah, they kind of won World War II, but a large chunk of the reason why people say, well, when you think about World War II, you really have to thank the Soviets for winning that war. No, fuck no, you don't have to thank the Soviets for winning that war. They would have starved to death had it not been for Lend-Lease. But the thing is, the Soviets spent a lot of time rewriting the history of World War II, making it sound like they were the ones who did everything. And the Western world did a rather piss-poor job of explaining the contrary. When you have 97% of the rail systems within the Soviet Union having been made in America, when you have, at the time of the salient that ended up turning the Eastern Front in Russia, it was something like, what was it? Adam, do you happen to remember? Was it 50-ish% or 75% of the tanks used in the breaking of the salient? Breaking of that bulge in the German lines were actually American-made tanks?
I don't think I can name a
You don't remember the
number.
percentage?
Yeah, right off the top of the head.
A large percentage of those tanks, though, were American-made tanks that ended up being used in that mechanized assault that ended up turning the Eastern Front. But we did a really piss-poor job of talking about that. And the Soviets did an amazing job of talking about how it was the Soviet heart and Soviet will and Soviet stick-to-itness that ended up turning the war. So now people talk about World War II as if the Soviets won it. Fuck no, they didn't. They would have starved to death. They would have lost. It wasn't until after the war had already turned and turned drastically that the Soviets, for the first time in the entire framing of the war, were able to produce more tanks per year than were being destroyed. The rest of the time, they would produce a tank, that tank would hit the battlefield, that tank would be destroyed, and then another tank would be destroyed on top of it. They were losing tanks throughout the war. They got a good chunk of their tanks. It was over 25% when you talk about the war as a whole, were American-made tanks used in the Soviet Union. Then, not only do you have over 25% throughout the entirety of the war were American-made tanks, but the majority of the tanks that survived multiple combat engagements were American-made tanks. T-34s, yeah, everyone talks about the glory of the T-34 and how impressive the T-34 was. Very few people talk about how easily cracked the T-34's armor was because they over-hardened it. Do you know what over-hardening of armor is, Adam?
No.
So when you're talking about armor, there's hardened armor, and you want hardened steel when you're talking about tanks, because hardened steel is harder to break. When you talk about over hardened armor, you're familiar. You like ancient history. You're familiar with obsidian daggers, right?
Yeah.
So obsidian daggers can hold an absolutely obscene edge. They're ridiculously sharp. In fact, they're so sharp that it was
Surgeons.
in only the past 2 decades that we have surgical knives that can meet and exceed obsidian sharpness.
But it's so fragile.
Exactly. And that was the problem. That's the reason why obsidian knives were phased out for much, much more malleable, so they aren't able to hold anywhere near as good of an edge, materials like copper and iron. Copper and iron are nowhere near as hard and able to hold an edge as obsidian. But the thing is that they hold their edge much better. They're far less likely to shatter. They're far less likely to snap in your hands if you hit something hard. So what you end up doing is, yeah, you'll have to sharpen it, but you're just going to have it dull rather than snap. Whereas obsidian, if you tried to make an obsidian sword, it will break in the first swing. It will do some unholy damage in that first swing, but it will snap, and you won't have a sword at that point. Whereas you have a copper sword, yeah, that sword will twist, that sword will bend, but all you do is you bend it back and you're able to swing again with the sword and you're good to go. So over-hardened steel is much the same, where over-hardened steel, yeah, it is hard to bend over-hardened steel. Much harder to bend than even a harder steel. But the problem is that if you're using over-hardened steel, it shatters. So what happened when it came to T-34s? T-34s used steel that was hardened much harder than the Western tanks. It was much, much harder than Sherman's, much harder than any of the English tanks, much harder than the Tiger tanks that the Germans were using. So if a round hit it, that round would not penetrate the armor very often. But what that round would do, quite often, is shatter the armor. So that first round would hit, it wouldn't actually pierce the armor, but it would send a massive crack throughout the entire armor. And sometimes, due to the over-hardening, it would cause spalding. Do you happen to know what spalding is?
Well, for the benefit of the audience, I would say no.
So, spalding is when metal is struck and the metal does not break, it does not get punched through, but what it does do is the interior layer, so the layer on the opposite side of where the force is originally applied, ends up cracking, and shards of that ends up being tossed inward. So when tank armor spalds, you'll have a tank that from the outside, it looks like it survived the shot. But then you take a peek at the crew inside, and it looks like a claymore went off. Because
okay.
shards of metal from the inside of the tank.
It's like a fragment or flak.
Yep, it is internal fragmentation. So with the T-34, you had a much greater rate of spalding than you had with any Western tank.
Ooh.
So the Sherman armor was more likely to be punched through than a T-34. The T-34 armor was much more likely to spald than the Sherman. And not only was it much more likely to spald, but the T-34 armor was much more likely to crack than the Sherman.
Okay, so what is this? Oh, whoa. What is this Kraken you're talking about? Oh, not the Kraken.
So, let's see. A really good example is ceramic that's used in a lot of dishes is actually extremely hard. And in many cases, that ceramic is harder than your kitchen knife. Sounds a bit weird, right?
Well, I mean, they have ceramic kitchen knives, right?
They do have ceramic kitchen knives now, and those are also, when they fail, they tend to shatter. So when you have a kitchen knife and you drop it on the ground, it might dull the blade, right? But you're able to pick it back up, you sharpen it back up, and it's good to go again. Because all it did was it rolled a section of blade. This makes sense, right?
Yeah, no, I got you.
So if you take a kitchen plate and you drop it, what happens to the kitchen plate?
It would shatter.
Yeah, it would break into small pieces. And yes, that's exactly why modern body armor, when it uses a steel plate, has an anti-spalding coating so that it doesn't do that fragmentation. But just like the kitchen knife versus the kitchen plate, the Sherman would be the kitchen knife in that example. So you can have a round hit of Sherman, and as long as it isn't hitting it hard enough that it punches through the Sherman, what happens is that the Sherman will be dented. So you knock out that dent, and the Sherman's still good to go. A T-34 would be that dining plate. If a round hits, it can hit with sufficient force that it didn't penetrate the armor of the T-34. But what it did was it shattered the T-34's armor, just like that kitchen plate. So there's a lot of examples from the war of T-34 armor that is cracked open like an egg.
Holy shit.
Because it hit hard enough to shatter the steel. And it's because the T-34 armor was over-hardened. But most people don't talk about this. They just hear about how hard the armor is, and they don't have a frame of reference to figure out, okay, is that hardness a good thing? Because everyone hears about how the T-34 had armor that was much harder than a Sherman tank. It was much harder than a Tiger tank. It was much harder than the Cromwell, than insert tank here. And that's made to sound like a good thing, because to most people that don't know anything about tank armor or armor in general, when they hear that this armor is harder than that armor, they go, oh, that's a good thing. And to a certain point, yes, it is an extremely good thing. Past that point, it is an extremely negative thing that makes that tank more dangerous to be in, and also makes it so that that tank will survive fewer shots.
Ooh. Yeah.
So it becomes a bit of a double-edged thing. But again, the Soviets were very, very good about putting out propaganda. So they were able to sell that their T-34s won the war. And because we didn't put enough information out on the other side, we didn't write the history well enough. We didn't point out that, well, yeah, the T-34 did its job, but these were the issues with its armor. And also, by the way, the T-34s weren't one of the major tanks that the Soviets had. And also, by the way, a good chunk of the tanks that the Soviets were fielding were American-made tanks. And oh yeah, by the way, all the rail lines that were used in order to transport the materials in order to make the T-34s were actually American-made rail lines. And oh yeah, by the way, nearly all of the locomotives, because I think it was 80-something% of the locomotives on those rail lines, which was 94% of the rail lines within the Soviet Union, were American-made locomotives. So all of that was actually due to American backing. And oh yeah, by the way, it was something near 99% of the telegraph lines that were used during the war were American made. And oh yeah, by the way, a good chunk of the food that was used in order to feed Soviet troops were sent by Americans because the Soviets were fucking starving. And oh yeah, by the way, a good chunk of their ammo was sent by America. And oh yeah, by the way, a good chunk of their firearms were sent by America. There were actually Tommy guns used by Russians during the Eastern campaign because they weren't able to produce their weapons fast enough. And oh yeah, by the way, and oh yeah, the oh yeah, by the ways can go on nearly endlessly due to the amount of Lend-Lease we sent the Russians. But the Russians did an extremely good job of rewriting the history. And it was much the same as the stories of Ares versus the stories of Athena, where the Russians were the Athenians. They wrote down their histories. They spent a hell of a lot of time talking about the glory of their own people and how, oh yeah, the others, they made a show, but they just discarded everything else. And we didn't have the proper attention to making sure that the history was a fuller accounting. Now, we could have gone in the exact opposite direction. For a little bit of time, we tried to go in the opposite direction, where we went, oh yeah, America was the only reason why the war was won. And no. When we're talking about the war, the most accurate presentation of the war, to my mind, is America, throughout most of the war, was the bankroll of the Allies. It provided arms, it provided armor, it provided materials, it provided funding that kept all the other nations alive and in the war. England was a rock that kept on getting beaten against and kept surviving. They were also an amazing information source, because a lot of the information that ended up winning us the war came by way of England. They spent a lot of time cracking the Enigma. They spent a lot of time cracking code after code after code. They did a lot of counterintelligence and intelligence work. They did amazing things during the war. So you have to give acknowledgement to England for its information networks that it built during the war. And Russia, it became a bit of an anvil where people just kept on being thrown into it and they kept on dying. Granted, a lot more Russians died than Germans died, but by surviving, it was able to buy time for the war to turn out how it was. And then when it was finally able to unass itself, because it did horrendous shit early on, one of the major things that a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to the war in the East is one of the major generals who actually was responsible for turning the war in the East was freshly liberated from the gulags. And he had been so horrendously tortured that, if I remember correctly, the records of him described him as not having one tooth that opposed another. So, in order to explain that,
Wait. What do you mean opposed another?
so not having one tooth that opposed another, in more lay terms, means that if he had a tooth on the top row of teeth, the tooth that tooth should bump against when he closes his mouth was missing. It was ripped out of his skull.
Well, why
If he had
did
a
you just
tooth
say that
on the
a tooth was missing? Wow. Fucking Mike Tyson. Missing. No, why didn't you just say that he had a tooth? Ah, son of a bitch.
well, because his
You got me
entire
in a
mouth
loop.
was checkerboarded in that way.
Oh, that's...
Where if he had a tooth on the top row, he didn't have that opposing tooth on the bottom row. If he had a tooth on the bottom row, he didn't have that opposing tooth on the top. Because in the gulag, those teeth were ripped out of his head.
Yeah.
He was horrendously tortured. And then he was released from the gulag when the Soviets were at their most desperate, and he ended up fucking doing his part to win the war. And he was one of the major generals that ended up turning the war around in the East. But this, again, is something that isn't often mentioned when talking about the war. And yeah, I've said many times, Green Badger, that it is a shame that America didn't listen to Patton when it came to the after the war period.
Mm-hmm.
Just like it is a shame that America didn't listen to MacArthur when it came to the Korean War. Because again, these are two parts of history that people don't really pay attention to for some fucking reason. We haven't done a good enough job explaining the story, and this is something that traces back to that idea that our understanding of Ares is hindered by the fact that most of our myths come by way of Athens. Our sense of history is hindered that we have so neglected the contributions of Patton and what Patton was arguing at the time. Because Patton ended up becoming rather notorious and rather frowned upon by certain elements of intelligentsia and the political powers. Because after the war, after World War II, they had just defeated Russia. Just defeated Germany. Patton was saying, okay, that was a good prelude to the war that we should be fighting. Give me an army, I'll march on Moscow. And that was really frowned upon. That he wanted to march on Moscow immediately after defeating Germany. But he was gung-ho on, yeah, we defeated the Nazis. They were a threat, but they aren't the main threat.
Yeah, there was a whole battle strategy. I can't remember what it was called, but it was they take over Germany and then turn the actual German
former Wehrmacht into
Yeah.
the ground troops for the war, or into a allied army
Yes.
in the war against the
Communists.
Communists.
Communists. Yeah. That's what they were looking at. They were like, dude, the Nazis are a problem, but holy shit, the communists are coming. Like, we might have to, yeah, we're gonna have to go and turn the German army, though, I'm not gonna say the name because I'm
The
pretty,
Wehrmacht.
yeah, Wehrmacht. And we're gonna have to go against the communists.
And actually, there was an interesting battle that almost no one knows about
Which one?
At the very end of World War II, when the Wehrmacht and the American army teamed up to siege a castle held by the SS.
Oh yeah, wasn't that in like Sweden?
I want to say yes. I could be wrong though.
It was up there though.
Yeah, it was either like northern Germany, possibly Sweden. But yeah, the SS held a castle, and the American army teamed up with the remnants of the Wehrmacht that was in the area. And they both attacked a castle held by the SS. And that was seen by many people, including Patton, as we can work with these people. It's clear that we can work with these people. We did work with these people in this instance.
It's not even that. It's we're dealing with humans that are looking at the same thing that we want to, achieve.
Yep.
So when you look at it like, oh yeah, you're dealing with the Waffen, or not the Waffen, or the fucking yes, yeah, I already forgot the German name for their army.
Wehrmacht.
Wehrmacht. Um, Wehrmacht with I think it was the Rangers actually. Might be wrong. But sieging this castle, it was against the SS. It was against a group of people that are not connected to any nation.
Well, they were connected to a party that was in control of a nation very shortly before.
Yeah, they're a parasite. They use the nation that they're controlling to seize power and work off of that.
Yeah.
Oh wow, are we going into tinfoil hat land now, or?
Well, it isn't even tinfoil hat. This is legitimate history.
Well, no, because listen. Let me tell you about the bells and the fucking Antarctica. Like, dude, we're going that route. I will take us that route.
Patton was very clear that what we need to do is we need to realize that there's a more serious opponent that we need to be taking seriously.
Dude, and Hitler was going around the fucking globe looking for artifacts.
Yep. And we need to be willing to recognize that this is the situation that we're in. We need to be willing to mobilize against them. And he, in my opinion, was absolutely right. Our best chance of taking out the Soviet Union early was right after World War II. We could have gone after them. We could have saved ourselves damn near a century of headache.
But that century of headache is exactly what was planned. They wanted it to happen.
See, I slightly agree and I slightly disagree, because I don't think that it was planned by some ridiculously large overarching cabal. I think that it was something that was damn near planned by a handful of people. Dude. And a very small handful of people. Because effectively, that was something that FDR should be recognized as one of the tyrants of the early 20th century.
I mean, he was a half and half, though. That's the thing. It did benefit a lot of people. It did help a lot of people, but at the same
really didn't, though. When you look at
exactly, it didn't.
Had short-term benefits for some people. It had long-term disadvantages for everyone. And it was something that was constant, and it was something that was obvious while he was still alive. His economic policies nearly drove the United States into a deeper depression than the Great Depression was. The only thing that saved it was Lend-Lease and the war. Lend-Lease saved our fucking ass economically.
But you got to remember, that was all. That was all placed on a ground. Okay, I'm not even. I'm not going to try and poetic it, but it was set up, dude. I mean, he was fresh off the depression. There's no way you could like. These people are clamoring for anything that they can get to. He sold it. That's why it was a soft trigger.
Like I said, I think that it.
I don't like him. Let's just
I
say
think that it
I'm
was
not a
something
fan of
that
FDR. So
he knew what he was doing
no, yeah.
because he got the evidence of what was the result of all his policies. So he knew, and various other people knew. He decided that that was something that he was willing to have happen in the name of his ideology, because he absolutely had an ideology. He admired the socialists of the time and he admired the communists of the time for their economic system. And he made it very clear that he admired them. It's no surprise that someone who deeply admired them tried to replicate them. And when he saw the downsides of replicating them, he went, well, yes, but this is in the name of a greater good. We're going to suffer in the short term, but in the long term, then we'll have this utopia and it'll be fantastic. Well, no, that long-term utopia never happens. It's impossible. It doesn't understand humanity. And he didn't really understand humanity. He understood humanity enough to manipulate people, but he didn't understand humanity in the long term. And then we had Truman, who sadly took after FDR in a large part because he maintained a lot of FDR's policies after FDR died. And he maintained FDR's policies not only with the existing groups that we had problems with, but he maintained FDR's policies with additional groups of similar ideology. Because when it came to MacArthur, in much the same vein as Patton, went, okay, yeah, let's fucking eradicate this group. Let's get rid of them. We can win this war, and we can win this war by completely defeating them. MacArthur, during the Korean War, this is something that, again, a lot of histories like to omit. When US troops really landed during the Korean War, South Korea was effectively gone. What happened was US troops landed. US troops pushed back to the parallel that is currently the DMZ. Do you know what happened immediately after US troops pushed back to the parallel? MacArthur was still in the lead of them. Do you happen to know, Adam?
I have a feeling you might tell us.
MacArthur effectively pushed to the Chinese border and sent back a message saying, I request permission to continue the fight, by which he meant, I request permission to invade China. Because he had already effectively annihilated North Korea. The North Korean government had been forced out of North Korea into China, and he requested permission to pursue them and also to take out China. And he said that we need to push our advantage, and now is the time that we could take out communist China and we could allow the Chinese nationalists to retake China. Because if we start pushing in from Korea and we push hard, the Chinese Nationalist Party, the CNP, would be able to push out of Taiwan into southern China, and we could meet in the middle. And then we could relinquish control of China back to the CNP. We'd get rid of communist China. We'd get rid of North Korea. Do you know what Truman ordered? Because, again, MacArthur was saying, we're here. I can continue this fight. I can win this fucking war. And not only can I win this war, I can absolutely destroy the enemy. Do you know what Truman ordered him to do? Adam?
What's that?
Truman ordered him to withdraw to the DMZ. He ordered him after he had so thoroughly defeated the North Koreans to allow the North Koreans to retake the land. And one of the battles that people point to as, oh, the Chinese were actually able to force back the Americans. There was one company of U.S. military against, I think it was something like 12 to 20 companies of the Chinese army. And the one company was holding and successfully holding until they were ordered to withdraw. There's a fantastic video one of my friends sent me recently about this, where it's some guy who he does a rather funny bit where he records his eyes and his mouth and then he cuts those out and pastes them on different countries and talks shit back and forth. And it's a very America fuck yeah style video. And the way that the dude phrased it, which is not inaccurate, was that one company was farming your companies for XP. Fuck you. Because, yeah, when you have one company versus somewhere between 12 and like 22 companies, and the one company is standing their ground and doing so rather fucking well, until they're ordered to retreat, that company didn't fucking lose the fight. That company didn't get beaten, didn't get pushed back. They were ordered to withdraw. There's a massive fucking difference. Which is why I've said that there's no way that you can say Korea was a loss. Because first off, Korea should have been a more devastating win than it was. But Korea wasn't a loss because the entire point of the war, sadly, according to the president at the time, or presidents, because it went slightly into the next president, but by that time the policy had already been put in place, was to ensure that South Korea survived and to reestablish the DMZ, reestablish the 38th parallel, if I remember correctly. I could have the number wrong. I think it's 38. It might be 37. It's 30-something.
Yeah.
Parallel. And that's what we did. Now, we should have done a fuck ton more, but that's what we did. And again, it's FDR and Truman after him allowed for the Soviet Union, as well as North Korea, as well as communist China, to continue surviving. And this is history that needs to be taught more, but it isn't. Because we just allowed the only history to be recorded to be the opponent's history. If the same thing had happened in Ireland, we wouldn't have half as many people supporting the Irish. But the thing is, the Irish were very, very good. Credit where credit is fucking due. The Irish were amazing at making sure that their history, that their version of each of the stories was told. And they would tell them orally, they would tell them in song, they would tell them visually, they would repeat them time and time again, and they would get praised by how well they did so. When you're talking about paintings, you have a painting that I've talked about I don't know how many fucking times because it is just so goddamn beautiful, and it is something that deserves all the credit I can give it when it comes to this. You have The Marriage of Strongbow and Aoife. It's an amazing painting in the Dublin National Gallery. And it is a painting. Let me pull it up again. I've shown you guys before, but let me pull this fucking thing up again. Because
what is it called?
It is The Marriage of Aoife and Strongbow.
Oh.
And it is a absolutely amazing painting that the first time that I showed it, I know the way that I showed it was I pulled it up and then I asked, I believe it was you, Dr. Functional, and a small handful of others, what you thought the story was of the painting. I didn't tell you what the story was. I didn't tell you any of the history behind it. I pulled up the picture and I said, what is the story of this painting? And you guys looked at it and you were able to figure out roughly the story. You weren't able to give names. You weren't able to give dates or anything like that. But you looked at the painting and you went, well, it's a group that is being conquered and their conquest is being sealed in marriage. And you were able to identify which group was the group that was supposed to be sympathized with and which group was the group that was supposed to be vilified in this painting. Because this is the painting. I just pulled it up again and I'm showing the screen of it. It's one painting, but it tells a story of an entire fucking war. Because you have the English knights that are all in armor and they are unharmed, but they're all cast in shadow. Throughout the entire painting, every English knight is cast in shadow. Then you have the Irish people that are lamenting their loss, lamenting their fallen. Their dead are piled up in heaps. You see a castle burning in the background. You see people wailing. You see a young woman being brought to the marriage with a English knight in shadow, a Norman knight in shadow, rather. And you see this one woman lit beautifully. She looks gorgeous. Her ladies in waiting are somber and sad behind her. It tells the entire goddamn story without you having to be told a single word of it, because all the Irish are in light, all the English, the Norman knights are in darkness. There's war behind, and then there's this marriage. And the Irish people at the marriage seem broken. This is a beautiful painting. It's beautiful at every fucking level, and it tells a story. And it's telling that story that makes it amazing. And it's something that is done so cleanly, so beautifully. And I unshared the screen because I don't think it needs to be. Fuck it. I'll just keep on having it because it is one of my favorite paintings, just because it is absolutely gorgeous. So I will share that screen again. But it is so well done, and it tells that story so beautifully that even without knowing the story, looking at the painting, you know the bones of it. And this is something that the Irish did very well. The Irish did that with their paintings, like this one. The Irish did that with their stories. There are countless stories, songs, and histories about the conquest of Ireland, about Ireland before, about what was lost, about the continuing fight in order to bring back Ireland. At the time, it's no longer really continuing, except some people continue it in North Ireland, which is a fucking mess. But you have By the Rising of the Moon, which is a play and a song about Irish people trying to organize and fight back against the English that they viewed as the occupiers. You have that in the play, or in the song, and it's by the rising of the moon, by the rising of the moon. We'll stand our pikes together by the rising of the moon. And it's this beautiful song when it's done in full, and it tells this story of resistance, of bravery, of knowing that you're probably marching to your death, but you're doing it because it is the right thing to do, which is noble, and it entices people. People love a good story. You have the Rising of the Moon play, which most of the play is two people. It is two people, a single set, and a barrel. And it's this amazing story. The artist for this particular one is Daniel McLeese. And it's The Marriage of Strongbow and Aoife, which is from 1806, or it was by Daniel McLeese, who lived from 1806 to 1870, and this one was painted in about 1854. And it's this amazing oil on canvas painting that takes up a good chunk of a wall. Because it's, let's see, about 5 feet by about 10 feet. So it's 5 feet tall and about 10 feet long. So this painting is enormous. But the Rising of the Moon play, it is two characters, a barrel, and a single set. And one of the characters is an Irishman that is employed as a police officer, and he's meant to find a resistance fighter or a terrorist, depending on who you ask, effectively, is a good chunk of the story. And then the other character is an Irishman. And the cop is rather nervous because he's heard about how dangerous this man is, how deadly this man is, how if he runs into this man, he needs to kill him, because if he doesn't kill him, the officer's life will be forfeit. Not because someone else will murder him, but because this man won't allow him to live. So, throughout the story, he's sitting on the barrel, on this dock, trying to see if the man comes this way. And he meets another Irishman, and he asks him for help because he's been tasked with this job. And the other Irishman agrees to watch with him. So they sit back to back on this barrel. They don't look at each other the entire time, and they just talk. And as they talk, if you're paying attention, you realize who the Irishman is. You realize what's happening. And you have the one cop who's been told all of these things about how horrendous this man is, how he is effectively a terrorist, how he kills indiscriminately, how he doesn't care about man, woman, or child, how he will sacrifice anyone for his own life. And you just hear their conversation. And as it goes, you find out that the dude that's sitting on the barrel with him is the same guy that he's been told to look for. And you realize that slightly before the cop does. But by that point, the cop has already been talking to him for a long time, through most of the night. And they've shared songs in order to pass the time. They've talked to each other, and it's this really well done, simple interpersonal play. It isn't quite so much a smear job. Well, from the play's perspective, it's a smear job how the terrorist or freedom fighter, depending on your point of view, is talked about. But it isn't always quite a smear job the way that the Irish talk. It's just that they have a different perspective on how the history progressed than the English do. Some of it is smear. Some of it is two sides that both are perfectly rational, talking about it in a way that isn't overly emotional. It isn't smearing each other, or it isn't intentionally smearing each other. It's just they view it in very, very different ways. And because they view it in very, very different ways, their take on the entire conflict is very different. And that's something that you have to acknowledge. At certain points, there are going to be... It's not good guy against good... or against bad guy. One of the tragedies of human existence is that quite often it is a good person fighting against a good person. And it's just their perspective. Both of them are trying to do the right thing. Both of them are trying to move towards what they think the world should be. But it's just they disagree. So there's a conflict between that. And it's a natural conflict. A conflict that you can't really fault either one. You can't say this one's evil, that one's good. It's two people that have their stance, and it ends up bloody. And it's sad because it ends up bloody. Especially when it's two people that you look at and you go, these are two people that they would have a connection. They would be friends. They would be at least amiable to each other. But their situation pitted them against each other. Sometimes there are villains, though. And you need to be able to recognize when there's villains and when there's just people disagreeing, and you have two good people trying to do what they think is right. And it's diametrically opposed. It's not... to some extent, yeah, one man's villain is another man's hero, but it's not entirely that. It's when you have two people fighting for their country. Both of them can be good people. It's just they're on different sides. Sometimes you have, one guy is fucking evil. Sometimes you have one of the countries is fucking evil. Sometimes it's two countries that are entering into something that makes complete sense from both sides, and it's depressing. Because, again, it's something that it didn't have to be that way, but it is, and it doesn't make it better. It doesn't make it easier. It, in many ways, makes it worse. When it's good versus evil, it's a very simple story. And just because, again, I was able to best you, and I first did a complete glory run where I didn't earn a single dollar, and then I decided that, you know what, perhaps it would be nice if rather than just resulting in the deaths of friends, I also got paid for their deaths. I decided to go back for an earning round. Just because you sucked at questions does not mean that I'm a villain. And I'm responding to Tyrannus in that. But it's something that, like I said, it's constant throughout history. It isn't necessarily the victor writes the history, because if the victor doesn't write history, then they aren't doing it by the very nature. And you have that constantly. The Norse, when they did the invasion of England, there's very little from the Norse perspective, even when they were winning. There's a lot from the Anglo perspective. When you're looking at the English versus the Irish, the English, it's very hard to argue that the English didn't win through the vast majority of that. And again, there wasn't all that much that they wrote in defense of what they did. So you end up with a lot of Irish works talking about how the English were fucking animals. And now you have a lot of people that think that, yeah, the English were fucking animals. And at some points, the English were fucking animals. Cromwell was an absolute bastard. It is hard to argue that Cromwell wasn't an absolute bastard. But that doesn't mean that they were throughout the entirety. And there was fucked up shit that the Irish were doing throughout. But the Irish didn't really write about what fucked up shit they were doing, and the English didn't write very much about the fucked up shit that they were doing up until the Troubles. And even at the Troubles, the Irish did a better job of selling their side. The English went a bit too much with, well, it's obvious which side is in the wrong when it comes to the Troubles. And to many people it was, because when you have shit like people nail bombing schools, it's very easy to go, yep, see, that side's the evil side. The side that nail bombed the school, they're the evil side. And people should go that way. But the Irish did a very good job about making the catchier songs, about telling the stories in such a way that we didn't want to nail bomb the school. We were forced to nail bomb the school. And we did it in response to the abuses that we suffered at the hands of the English. So it wasn't really our fault. And to some people, that was rather convincing. Because again, the victor writes history isn't so accurate. It's that a lot of people can write histories. The person who writes the most convincing history, the person who makes or who writes the most interesting history, writes the histories that actually stick. Would you agree with that position, Adam?
I think I'd agree. Yeah.
And it's just something that drives me crazy, because I always hear, well, victors write history. Tell that to the Greeks. The Greeks wrote most of Roman history, even though they were defeated. Tell that to the native Chinese during the Mongol conquest, because the native Chinese wrote most of the Chinese histories. Tell that to the Irish. Tell that to group after group after group. But I've been nattering on for quite some time. Do you have any topics that you wanted to talk about, Adam? Because I've talked about one long rant.
um, shit. Honestly, at the beginning when I uh when I
At the
first
beginning you
joined up,
did, but then I nattered on for too long and you've forgotten.
well, no, I was gonna ask if you had seen the hearings of the weaponization of the FBI or the government.
Oh yeah, I have heard quite a bit. So you want to talk about that?
I mean, do you? Holy shit, we've been going
I'm
on for.
absolutely game.
All right. Well, hold on. Do you think you'd be able to entertain the chat and subsequent audience for a little bit as I uh look, my toaster, it needs to
As
be
you relieve yourself.
sure. Yes. Uh Pardonnez-moi. S'il vous plaît.
Yep. But yeah. So how are you doing tonight, chat? Was my rant extraordinarily tedious, or did you find it interesting? Do you guys agree with my take that it isn't necessarily the victor that writes history, it's the person who actually writes that writes the history? Because not only are the examples that I listed, but when you look at the Cold War, the West won the Cold War. When you look at the histories, there's a lot of communists that write histories. There's a lot of people that say that the communists were the clearly superior option and that they were undermined and they were unjustly undone by the evil capitalists of the Western world. Despite the starving, despite the abuses, despite all of the horrendous shit that happened behind the Iron Curtain and its subsequent iterations and other analogous versions from various other horrendous regimes. You have. It's hard to say that Europe didn't dominate the world. In fact, even the histories that say that Europe is morally bankrupt and did undue or untold harm to the rest of the world admits that Europe conquered the world. But you look at the histories and it's full of, but the moral victories were with the other nations. And they completely ignore the histories of those nations. They ignore that when the conquistadors overthrew the Aztecs, they treat that as if that was some horrendous thing. What it meant was that the tribes near the Aztecs were no longer being fucking eaten, like legitimately eaten and sacrificed, and horrendous shit happening to them. Yeah, the Spanish weren't fantastic, but they were a hell of a lot better than the Aztecs. And you see that a lot with Native American history, where it's always, oh, America, yeah, it conquered the natives, yeah, it did this, but it was just genociding them. When no, most of the shit that they're talking about, they were two-sided wars. Were there times that America fucked up? Yeah, there were times that America fucked up. Were there a lot of times that the natives fucked up? Oh, fuck yeah, there were a lot of times that the natives fucked up. And you need to be able to actually look at the history, learn the history, and that's a failing of people that know the actual history. That would be rather interesting if there was a parallel world where there was a version of me that was advocating for communism. Because communism is anathema to me. And I hate the fact that we have so many people that try to make communism the moral victor, even if they weren't the actual victor. They weren't a moral victor. They weren't an actual victor. They were a despotic regime that fucked over humanity. And their continuation is causing untold harm to human development. There is no unyielding evolution of history. There was no unyielding evolution of evolution either. There's change. Sometimes change is good, sometimes change is bad. But there's always change. And communism is not the obvious end result of capitalism.
Yes, I agree.
I bought some time for you. Now you get to talk.
Oh. Oh shit. Oh.
Aha.
Well,
You thought you could just coast by on me talking shit and ranting, didn't you? Well, you were wrong.
you gotta go check toaster too.
Nah, I'm just letting you talk.
Oh.
Rather than just continuing to rant.
Well,
And now that the pressure's on, he's locking up. He has a bit of stage fright, people.
well, not stage fright. Just I don't know what to say. I don't really have anything to say.
Are you a shy pisser?
Like I could. I don't. I don't
Did you
even
have
have
any
like a
problems?
rant.
You wanted to touch on the findings of the undermining of democracy by the state apparatus, namely the state investigative apparatus.
You know, now that you mention it, that I I do have some grievances that I probably wouldn't mind indulging on.
Treat it as Festivus and give you a rant because I've ranted for nearly 2 hours.
Well, but
And
hold
actually,
on.
after saying that I didn't need to piss, I kind of do. So you rant away
Oh
and
no.
I'll shout in when I'm done.
Oh no. Okay. Uh, shit. Well, okay. So, uh, like I said, I had some things in mind to talk about, but I will say this mac and cheese is very calming and relaxing. So, it might be a bit slow to get into it, but I will say uh, tomorrow I hope to try and play some Tears of the Kingdom for the first time. Because holy shit, I want to build some mechs and stuff, uh, and play around in Zelda with that. Um, what was the other thing? Oh yeah, there was the hearings that I watched with, or I didn't watch it live, but um, I was watching it, or I watched it on or listened to it while I was working.
Come
Um,
on, Adam. I tied in religious esoterica from mythology into a modern idea.
I was getting there. Oh, um, check it out. So at work, we built up a whole nother table, so we can test out some more uh, Mac systems. Um, and we built another desktop that we can wipe hard drives on it. We called it a mule. The first one's a
Hmm.
mule, and the second one, um, during the meeting that we were, like, oh yeah, we built this thing, and haha, we got a second mule. And I said, you know what? That's not nice. You shouldn't call it a mule. It should be having a little bit of dignity. And they were like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you should call it Eeyore. Oh, it was
I don't
bad.
know.
No, I
I would
said donkey.
prefer. Yeah, I'd prefer if Eeyore was a bit of a mule. That means that we don't have to worry about additional generations of Eeyore.
Well, that's the thing. I was like, wait, but Eeyore is not a donkey, is
Eeyore's a
it?
donkey.
It's not a mule, though.
No, he's not a mule. He's a
Yeah,
donkey.
they're two separate things.
Yeah, donkeys are able to reproduce and have progeny that are able to continue to reproduce so long as they aren't hybridized with horses, whereas mules are sterile
God.
because mules and hinnies are the progeny of a union of donkeys and horses.
Well, I guess you could tell I'm not a farmer.
But you wanted to talk about the FBI and the CIA.
Oh yeah, you want to talk about that? Did you watch the hearings?
Yeah, I was able to listen in on all the shit that's come out and how, yeah, everything that people have been saying was true.
Well,
And then
the
some.
the crazy thing is, I was just surprised how fervent the Democrats were. Well, you're not an actual whistleblower because nobody signed the certification that said that you're a whistleblower. So you're just a disgruntled employee. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like,
Yep.
he's he's saying,
Because
hey,
we haven't signed off on your whistleblower status. We aren't going to call you whistleblower.
or even the shit that they, I don't understand why they kept going like, hey, did you see this tweet? And you responded to it. Why did you respond? Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like,
Yep.
wow. It's
Well, it's the same shit as always. It's trying to senselessly undermine.
it's catty.
Yeah.
Like I'm watching it, and it's like literally like some like goofy fucking movie set where they're like, oh yeah, no, yeah. So you said this. Even with the first guy, where they're like, hey, we have this tweet. Are you this guy? And he's like, no, that's not me. Oh, okay. Well, this guy said this. What do you think? Well, it wasn't
I'm not
me.
that
So
guy. Why the
yeah,
fuck does it
what
matter?
the fuck? Like, why are you? Oh my god. And these are the people that are fucking supposedly representing us.
Yep. Yeah. It's something that happens constantly where we just fucking ignore all of this shit. And it's infuriating because it should be something that we can all agree that if a federal agency is putting their thumb on the scale, that is a bad thing. But
Well, hold on.
they don't want
That's
to
an
acknowledge
that's an
that.
easy bug net and catch, right?
Yeah.
Because when you sit there and you say, yeah, this should be an easy win, right? You don't want these powerful government agencies to be able to have this type of oversight and authority over people. That's a bad thing. That's bad news bears. When you sit there and when you catch the people who is like, well, actually, I think it's a good thing because you can find the people. It's like, look at that guy. Yeah, that's the guy.
Yep.
That's the guy that's gonna fucking call. You know what? I saw him flying a flag, and I didn't like it. You should probably have some police going over there. You don't want that guy. That's not a good person.
Yep.
Where are we getting into? This is getting nuts. This is getting nuts.
Yeah. When you have people that are so desperate in order to justify an abuse of power, that should immediately be a sign of, oh, you should never be given any sort of power in your life. Because the people that are eager to abuse power or eager to justify the abuse of power, they are the very least they contain the subset of people that will abuse power. It's kind of like how when you're looking at what's the rate of people that will actually commit acts of violence, well, that's very hard to estimate. But if you have stats that say, well, 10% of people of this group either often or sometimes support violence in the name of their group, then you're able to go, okay, yeah, that 10% is the group that's going to commit the violence. Because if someone's never able to condone violence in the name of their group, they're never going to be the ones that actually commit the violence. It's the people that sometimes or always.
Yeah, you're never gonna get a accurate count of, the people who are causing the problems. But
Yeah.
with this hearing, though, not only did it show that there really is a pushback against these people talking about stuff, because again, they were saying, hey, we're being retaliated against. So
Yep.
it's a discretion against other whistleblowers. Nobody else wants to do it because, hey, look what happens.
Yep.
Um,
And oh yeah, by the way, you made it illegal to push back against whistleblowers, but now you're pushing back against us for whistleblowing.
well, yeah. I mean, it's just like it's goofy because it's like, dude, this this is exactly the Al Capone looking guy sitting there with a baseball bat. Man, you got some nice looking windows here. Like, are you fucking serious? And we're watching it now.
Yep.
Watching it. Sorry, I followed the Popeye Twitter account. Um, he needs to spin it. Also, the new comic that he has going on, it looks pretty good. But the with the FBI going out and not only surveilling like people,
Knowingly lying in order to get the warrants,
knowingly lying
not
to
bothering to get the warrants when they know that they should be getting warrants, knowingly misconstruing the evidence that they receive for the warrants that they knowingly lied in order to get the ability to go get. Yeah, all that shit.
well that and I think they every time they had a birthday party, it was just a straight one layer of vanilla cake. So I mean, they were cutting costs, but they were cutting costs in the wrong areas. This is where government malfeasance we need to address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that has been warned about time and time again throughout our history. And it's a lesson that we're choosing to ignore in a large part. And it's infuriating that we're choosing to ignore it. And again, the part that pisses me off is this is shit that was easily predictable because I go back to the start of the CIA. When you have the CIA being started by the dissolution of it was OSS, right? Office of Strategic Services.
Yep.
When you have OSS gets caught doing shady shit. So they scrap OSS and they start up a new agency in order to have a fresh start. So they start up the Central Intelligence Agency. And then they're trying to figure out who the hell they should staff their Central Intelligence Agency for or with. And then they look around and they go,
hold
well,
on.
all these people that are now out of the job from the OSS, let's staff the new agency that's meant to get rid of all the problems that we had with the OSS, full of all the people that we had problems with in the OSS. That won't cause a problem. That will be perfectly fine. There surely won't be any issues with that. And then we find out immediately after starting the OSS, or after starting the CIA with all the people from the OSS, that we just caught the OSS dosing American citizens with various psychoactive drugs. We're fucking surprised when the CIA is dosing American citizens with psychoactive drugs.
Sanguine.
Yes.
How far down the rabbit hole do you want to go?
That's not even rabbit hole. We have the documents.
No, well, that's the point. There is a rabbit hole, and we can go down it. But do you want to do this, or because we've been going 2 hours coming up?
Nearly. I just had to get that rant out of my system because it pisses me off every time that it becomes, well, why are we not trusting? Well, because we didn't trust the agency that was founded by, and we dissolved that agency, and now we're surprised that the agency that we made, staffing it with all the shitheads from the first agency, didn't fucking work out.
Well,
how are we surprised?
The first ripple looked decent enough.
This is something that is completely understandable. It's kind of like how one of the things that really pissed me off when it came to a lot of the international laws about war is it boils down to, every strategy that actually works for war, you aren't allowed to do it. Like, one of the things that was a clear example of that is we had to stop waging psychological warfare upon terrorists in the Middle East, because what we started doing in the Middle East was, when we were able to push into an area and make a base, we set up these massive loudspeakers around the base.
Oh, yeah.
That had on repeat in the local language, these groups have been defeated. If you are a member of one of these groups, surrender now. You will be treated fairly. You will not be harshly punished. You will not be killed. Throw down your arms, come forward, surrender, and you will be allowed to return to your life. And we would have major victories broadcast over these speakers. We would have the bigwigs that we took out. We just found your leader, so-and-so. Like, we found your leader. Let's say Abu Muhammad. We found your leader, Abu Muhammad. Abu Muhammad was killed in this engagement. Your leadership has died. Turn yourself in. And we would do that, and it was effective. People were throwing down their weapons and turning themselves in. And then we were told, well, that's psychological warfare. You need to stop. That's against all these regulations. And I'm going, no. You want to talk about the psychological warfare that shouldn't be allowed? How about playing Sounds of Hell outside a religious compound in Texas? That is the shit that shouldn't be allowed. Whereas when you're talking about shit that should just be considered, yeah, that's good tactics. Shit that saves lives, shit that prevents additional bloodshed, like, you've already lost. You're going to lose. Surrender now.
Are you talking about Waco?
Yes, I was talking about Waco.
Yeah, and they played a Yeah, hell is the best description, I
Yeah,
would say.
Sounds of Hell is a succinct description because they played the screaming of animals, the weeping of women, the screaming of children, the screaming of women, the death rattles of various creatures, including I think they had some humans that it was like the sounds of executions. And then various languages layered over top of each other was being played outside of Waco. And you're going, okay, no. That is psychological torture. That is fucked up shit. Just playing, you've lost, surrender, you've lost, surrender, you've lost, surrender, on repeat. That isn't psychological torture. That's just bog standard. Give the fuck up. And if it's effective, keep playing that shit.
Yeah, there's, I mean, I think there's gonna be a lot of awakening for a lot of people.
I hope so. But
Me too.
the problem is, going back to what my rant was about, when all the media, most of the intel, most of the people that other people hear the histories, they hear the stories, they hear what's going on, or all on one side, that side ends up gaining a large element of ideological supremacy. Which is why one of the things that people need to do is if you disagree with the current situation, undo what was done. And by undo what was done, we already have their game plan. We know what they did. They infiltrated government agencies. They infiltrated education. They infiltrated HR. You really want to change things. If you have the ability, get into education. Get into government positions. Get into HR departments. And very gradually work to undo it. If you're in HR departments and you see someone who all their profile pictures are warning colors in the animal kingdom and they're talking incessantly about social justice and shit like that, don't fucking hire. If you're in education and someone is not passing because they don't have the information, fucking fail them. If you're in government and you hear about something ridiculous, vote against it. And encourage others to do the same. If you have the ability, start to work towards undoing this shit. Or rather, not only if you have the ability, if you have the ability and you have the interest and you have the will to do so, that's what you should do. Because if you have no interest in education, don't go into education. If you have no interest in being a servant to the people, don't go into politics. If you have no interest in dealing with people, then HR is probably not for you. But if you have interest in that, if you can tolerate that, go do it. We need to start retaking those elements of society. And there's other shit that you can do. If you are starting a family, raise your kids right. Give them good lessons. Talk to your friends. Treat people like people. Because this is something that I've talked about before. No one changes their mind from threats of violence. They might hide what they believe, but they aren't changing their mind. They aren't changing their mind when you punch them in the face. In great many cases, they're thinking that they've been vindicated when you attack them. Only respond with violence to violence. And if someone if you're interacting with someone who has a different belief than you, be nice to them. Because this is, again, something that I've talked about. When you look at Daryl Davis, I think that's the guy's name. That's the blues singer, right? Blues singer that got over 200-something KKK members to leave the KKK.
Yeah, yeah.
It was Daryl Davis.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, if you have the patience to be a Daryl Davis, do it. Because people don't separate from hateful ideologies just because someone called them a mean name or treated them like shit. It, in fact, makes them more likely to continue their ridiculous shit. Whereas if you're kind, we see this constantly in the stories of people that end up leaving hate groups. It's not, well, someone punched me in the face hard enough and I thought differently. It's never, well, people attacked me and said I should die and I changed my mind. It's always, I ended up meeting someone. There's a bunch of articles about neo-Nazis that talk about how they ended up changing from being neo-Nazis. And the story is almost 100% of the time. So I was at this location or another. I was in a bad place in my life. And I met someone. They were a Jew. It was round the holidays. I couldn't go home to see my family. I didn't really have many friends, and this person realized I was in a bad way. What they did was they invited me into their home. And they knew I didn't like them, but they invited me anyways. I went against my better judgment, and when I was there, they didn't chastise me, they didn't attack me, they didn't do anything. They gave me food. They treated me like a member of their family, even though they knew my view on them. They knew the shit that I would talk about. They knew what I would say to them. And they still just treated me like I was a person. So that was what made me realize, oh God, I've been saying this horrendous shit about these people, and then they treat me like I'm worthwhile. That's what actually gets people to change their mind. That's what makes people step away from hateful beliefs. It's when they're given the proof that what they once believed isn't accurate. If they think that all Jews are evil, well, give them the example of a Jew that is good, and not just in argument, but in practice. If they think that all white people are evil, be the good white guy. Be the person that, and by good white guy, I don't mean, well, see, I'm willing to sell out other people of my race. I mean, go, okay, man, you're having a hard time. Here, let's get you some food. Here, let's do this. Here, let's do that. And I'm not saying do that when it's, well, they're assaulting people on a Subway, and no one asked if they could get him food. No, that's stupid shit. That isn't what I'm saying. But when it's when you have the opportunity to just be human to someone, be human to them. Don't treat it like you need to be paid off. Don't treat it like it's something that you're being oh so fucking special by being nice. Just be nice. Well, do you have anything to add to that, Adam?
Um, what? To uh suggestion that to be nice.
Well,
What
just what I
is
was saying
to
in
on that?
general. The ways of actually talking people out of horrendous ideology is
Oh,
giving them that tactile, obvious example of where their ideology fails. And not by being an asshole, not by really setting out to prove it, but just being a decent person.
oh. Well, then you can start walking into the area where people start saying, "Do you need religion to have that morality type of viewpoint?"
And I disagree with that.
Oh,
I vehemently disagree with that because I don't think that I'm an absolute bastard, and I definitely don't have religion.
you're not a, you're not a
No.
bastard. No.
I think that you can be that just decent person without having to have religion. For some people, religion might help, but there's a lot of things that, well, it might help a person to have X, Y, or Z, but that isn't necessary. And it isn't always good to have a crutch, because I view it somewhat as a crutch. If you can stand, stand. If you can walk, walk. If you need help to do either, get the help that you need. But the moment that you're able to do so without that assistance, do it. That's my take. That's my view on it.
That's just a fine view.
But yeah, anything else that you want to talk about, or shall we call it a night?
Mm, I don't know. What else is. I mean, we haven't gone into World War III yet, so I guess that's a good thing.
Yep, always good to avoid a World War III, unless World War III is absolutely necessary. Then avoiding it is bad. Do what needs to be done at the right time.
That's true. I mean, hopefully it'll be I can stay home from work. So,
Nice.
eesh. But yeah, no, I got nothing.
So, parting word, and also Rotten Corpse adds in that he's apparently a Biblo.
A what?
A Biblo, a bastard, a illegitimate child,
Oh,
a accident baby, a surprise baby. A bunch of different ways of
oh well, I'll yeah,
but yeah.
dude, that was like a fucking okay. Yep, we're good.
Shall we go to parting words? And
Sure.
if so, what are your parting words?
My parting words is Wow, it's Friday. Well, now technically it's Saturday. It was a fun show.
Always
Um,
fun being able to bullshit.
dude, and bullshit indeed. When you said it was just gonna, when you said it initially, when it was gonna be, yeah, we're just gonna shoot the shit.
Belly up to the bar and shoot the shit, yeah.
You were 100% correct.
It's
And
what I have the most fun doing. Planning out everything, it has its perks, it has its virtues, but to me, I much prefer just having a conversation and going where the conversation goes.
dude, it was a nice cap off to the fucking week. It was
Yep,
nice. I loved it. I
good to
love
hear.
it. Oh, okay, hold on. I can't say that because we gotta. It was a very professional conversation that we had. No, it was good.
Mm-hmm.
um, but yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks again for letting me hang out with you.
Always
And
fun.
for all you audience members, I hope you had a good time and enjoyed the conversation and the goofs that we did. Um, yeah, love
Mm-hmm.
you all. Good night.
And if that's your parting words, I'll leave off with my standard. If you're passionate about something, make sure that you devour it. Don't let it devour you. And with that, have a good night, all. The zoo is closed.
Saludos.
And now I wake up my mouse again and I click the end broadcast and it